Have you ever witnessed an act so unjust that it sent shockwaves through an entire airplane and even halted the journey at 30,000 feet? Picture this: a crowded Boeing 737. A routine flight turned chaotic when one black woman is barred from sitting in the exit row. It seems like a minor inconvenience until a mysterious phone call to the captain changes everything. In the next breath, the plane's engines power down, hushed whispers ripple through the cabin, and every passenger realizes that a confrontation on board has escalated into a life-altering drama. Stay tuned to discover what unfolds when truth privilege and a secret owner's intervention collide mid-air. Cassandra Lewis stood in the bustling terminal of San Francisco International Airport, cradling a sleek black carry-on while scanning a departure board packed with blinking updates. It was peak summer travel season, and the concourse thrummed with rushing travelers and airport announcements. She had arrived extra early. Her father always said, "Early is on time is late," to ensure she secured an exit row seat for the extra legroom. At 6 feet tall, Cassandra often found regular seats painfully cramped, and that day comfort was high on her priority list. Around her, families juggled strollers and stuffed backpacks. Business travelers tapped at laptops and tourists snapped selfies against panoramic airport windows. Cassandra loved how airports brimmed with stories, countless people crossing paths for a few fleeting moments. She found a seat near Gate 47, where her flight with Aerosky wings was scheduled to depart in less than 2 hours. As she waited, she replayed a phone conversation from the night before with her close friend, Nia. "You don't owe anyone an explanation or apology for wanting an upgrade," Nia had told her. "I know, but something about flying always makes me anxious," Cassandra replied. "It's 2025, Cass. The world's changing." "You'll be fine," Nia reassured. Cassandra wanted to believe her friend's optimism, yet she'd faced too many microaggressions in her life to let her guard down completely. Despite being a marketing executive at a prestigious firm, she had learned to anticipate roadblocks, especially in spaces where unconscious biases lurked. When the boarding gates finally opened, Cassandra's heart fluttered with excitement and relief. She had been told by the check-in attendant that exit row seats were still available, and she'd specifically requested one. With her boarding pass in hand, marked Exit Row, she stepped onto the jet bridge, leaving behind the bright lights of the terminal for the cool, pressurized air of the Boeing 737's interior. She was ready to settle in, open a new novel, and enjoy the flight that would carry her to her cousin's wedding in Chicago. Little did she know that this journey would become the stage for a clash that would test her resolve and captivate an entire flight of onlookers. Upon entering the Boeing 737 cabin, Cassandra noted the standard row arrangement: 6 seats across a snug aisle and overhead bins that passengers fought to fill first. Flight attendants sporting crisp navy uniforms helped guide people along. The aircraft was nearly full, and the thick hum of voices wrapped around Cassandra like a warm yet claustrophobic blanket. Locating her row near the front of the wing, Cassandra carefully placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment. Seat 12A, an aisle seat in the exit row, was her assigned spot, presumably guaranteeing her extra space to stretch her legs. She smiled gratefully. It felt like a small victory to secure comfort on this lengthy flight. She settled down, and a sense of relief began to seep in. She had always found the mechanical whir of planes oddly comforting proof that technology was powering humankind forward. Tucking her phone into the seat pocket, Cassandra watched as fellow travelers hustled to stow their luggage and find their seats. A mother and child duo quietly shuffled into the row behind her. Across the aisle, a teenage boy wearing oversized headphones scrolled mindlessly on his phone. Then came the last wave of passengers. In the swirl of commotion, a tall, broad-shouldered flight attendant named Marcus came down the aisle. He gave Cassandra a friendly nod at first, then paused as though realizing something amiss. His initially courteous smile faded into an uncertain frown. "Ma'am," Marcus said, leaning down to catch Cassandra's eye. "Could I see your boarding pass, please?" Cassandra handed it over without a second thought, noticing a strange glimmer of confusion in his eyes. He studied the document as if something didn't add up. "Huh," he muttered under his breath, then handed it back with a slightly forced politeness. "I'll be right back, ma'am," he said, and hurried off in the direction of the front galley. Cassandra shrugged, thinking maybe it was just a standard check. She caught the eye of an older woman 2 seats away, who gave her a tentative smile. Perhaps it was nothing. At least that's what Cassandra told herself. Yet from the way Marcus's demeanor abruptly changed, a familiar ripple of tension prickled Cassandra's nerves. Something was off, and she couldn't quite shake the feeling that a storm might be brewing. Minutes later, the commotion of final seatings had died down. Overhead bins were shut, and some passengers were already dozing. Cassandra pulled out her novel, a contemporary fantasy she'd been meaning to finish, and was just about to lose herself in its world when Marcus returned, flanked by another flight attendant named Regina. Regina, a shorter woman with neatly braided hair and a no-nonsense aura, wore a look of resolute authority. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to move you from this seat," Regina announced, her tone clipped yet measured. Cassandra stared up at her in confusion. "But," why she asked, making sure to keep her voice calm and respectful. She handed over her boarding pass again. "I requested the exit row at the check-in counter, and they gave me 12A. Regina shook her head. "There seems to be a mistake. This seat is restricted, and we have certain guidelines that have to be followed. We'll need you to switch to a different seat." Cassandra felt an all-too-familiar pang in her chest. She noticed that Regina was avoiding eye contact, choosing instead to look at the seatbelt or the floor. "I'm sorry, but I'm physically capable. If there's an emergency, I can assist just like anyone else. And it's printed right here on my boarding pass." Regina exhaled, glancing at Marcus. "I understand. However, it's my job to ensure the passengers sitting in the exit row meet FAA guidelines. You must be willing and able to operate the exit. The final decision is at the discretion of the flight crew." Cassandra noticed that Regina's voice carried an unspoken insinuation, as if doubting Cassandra's capabilities. "What makes you think I'm not able to help in an emergency?" Cassandra asked carefully. "I'm well above the required age, speak English fluently, and I'm actually stronger than I look. It's just policy," Regina said, her expression turning frosty. "We'd like to seat you elsewhere. Please gather your belongings." The tension thickened in the row. Fellow passengers peered over seat backs, their gazes flickering with curiosity or sympathy. Cassandra's heart hammered. She knew she had a right to sit there, and yet the flight attendant's words felt final. But she also sensed something more, perhaps fear, prejudice, or simply misguided assumptions. Whatever it was, she knew it wasn't right. Despite the tightness growing in her chest, Cassandra took a breath, determined not to let anger consume her. She closed her book and looked at Regina squarely. "I'm sorry, but I've already checked with the gate agent. I meet all the guidelines. If there's an emergency, I'm more than capable of assisting. I'd like to stay here." Regina's posture stiffened. In that moment, a hush seemed to sweep down the aisle. One by one, other passengers turned their attention toward the unfolding standoff. Cassandra could feel eyes on her, some empathetic, others impatient or merely curious. She reminded herself to remain calm, because the moment she raised her voice, she risked being labeled the angry black woman. She refused to give them that narrative. Marcus leaned toward Regina and whispered something. Regina's jaw set her composure, trembling with tension. Then she addressed Cassandra again, more firmly this time. "Ma'am, I'm telling you as the lead flight attendant that you cannot sit in this row. Please move, or we will contact security." At the mention of security, Cassandra's heartbeat accelerated. She felt her palms grow sweaty. This was turning into a showdown she never asked for. But she couldn't just fold under unjust pressure. She recalled her father's advice, "Don't let anyone push you out of a space you've rightfully earned." That sentiment had guided her through business school corporate boardrooms and everyday life. It guided her now. "I'm not refusing to comply with safety regulations," Cassandra explained in a measured tone. "I'm simply insisting on my right to occupy the seat that was issued to me. If there's an emergency, I'll help. If you have a reason to believe I can't, I'd like to hear it." Regina glanced around, possibly realizing that the entire row and neighboring rows were now paying close attention. Whispers flitted through the cabin. Marcus looked torn, as though regretful that he'd escalated this issue. After all, everything about Cassandra, from her physique to her demeanor, indicated she could handle an exit row seat. But something in Regina's stance suggested deeper motivations were at play. Cassandra braced herself for an even bigger confrontation. A pregnant silence filled the cabin's midsection. From a few rows ahead, a business traveler swiveled in his seat to watch, eyebrows raised in mild disbelief. A mother leaned to whisper something to her son, who looked more intrigued than frightened. The tension between Cassandra and the flight attendants was now a spectacle, and Cassandra felt the heat of the spotlight. "I'm sorry, but we can't continue this conversation forever," Regina said, pulling herself up to her full height, though still several inches shorter than Cassandra. "We have to prepare for takeoff." Cassandra swallowed hard. A swirl of conflicting emotions coursed through her. Part of her wanted to relent to avoid further trouble, maybe even to get up and move to a cramped seat in the back. Another part, the part that remembered the countless times she'd been overlooked, underestimated, or discriminated against, refused to yield. In the seat across the aisle, an elderly African-American man gently cleared his throat. "Excuse me, flight attendant," he said, voice quivering with age but strong in conviction. "I've seen plenty of people sit in that row. This lady looks perfectly capable. Why do you have a problem with her?" Regina's brow furrowed. "Sir, this does not concern you," she snapped, perhaps more harshly than intended. The man's wrinkled face flinched. Cassandra's jaw tightened. She felt a fresh wave of anger at the attendant's dismissive tone. Suddenly, a voice emerged from behind Cassandra, a young white woman in her 20s. "We're not leaving until this is sorted out." "Right?" she asked Regina. "I don't see any reason to move her. If there's an emergency, I'd want someone like her helping out. She looks fit enough to handle anything." Cassandra offered a grateful nod to the woman. Still, Regina remained unmoved. "We're following safety protocol," she repeated clearly, aware that her reasons were flimsy but unwilling to admit wrongdoing. At last, Regina turned and marched toward the front of the plane. Marcus gave Cassandra a small apologetic shrug before following Regina. Cassandra closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. The flight was minutes from departure, but everything was up in the air, literally and figuratively. She clutched the armrests, trying to steady herself. Unbeknownst to everyone on board, the conflict was about to escalate to unimaginable heights. In the cockpit of the Boeing 737, Captain Tobias Grayson was performing his last pre-flight checks. A seasoned pilot with over 2 decades of experience, he prided himself on efficiency and calm under pressure. He was reviewing the final approach procedures into Chicago when Regina's voice crackled through the interphone. "Captain, we have a problem in the cabin," she said, her voice tight with tension. "A passenger is refusing to vacate the exit row seat after being instructed to move. We might need the gate staff or security to intervene." Grayson frowned. It was never a good sign when flight attendants requested security, especially if the flight was already behind schedule. Still, regulations demanded the flight crew settle any seat disputes, particularly with exit rows. He decided to investigate personally. Leaving the cockpit in the capable hands of his co-pilot, Grayson stepped out into the cabin. He immediately noticed the hush that fell upon rows 10 through 15. Regina stood at the center of the aisle, arms folded, while Marcus hovered behind her, looking uneasy. Cassandra sat calmly in seat 12A, exuding both dignity and quiet frustration. The tension was palpable. "Good afternoon, folks," Grayson announced, his authoritative pilot voice carrying through the cabin. "I'm Captain Grayson." What seems to be the issue, Regina launched into a brisk summary. Cassandra interjected calmly with her version of events. She'd been issued. The seat legitimately was fully willing to comply with emergency guidelines and saw no reason to move. Grayson listened attentively, noting the composure and clarity in Cassandra's argument. "Let me see the boarding pass, please," Grayson requested. Cassandra handed it over. He studied it, seeing that it indeed had exit row printed. The seat assignment was valid. Turning back to Regina, he asked quietly, "Is there any specific reason you believe she's not fit to sit here?" Regina appeared momentarily flustered. I have to use my discretion," she sputtered. "She might not be able to assist if there's an emergency." Grayson's discerning gaze darted between Regina and Cassandra. Physically, Cassandra looked more than capable, athletic build, no visible impairments, calm demeanor. He also noticed that Cassandra wore an expression of quiet indignation, as though she'd been forced to prove her worth too many times before. The captain took a breath, aware that hundreds of eyes were watching. "Well, unless there's a specific FAA concern we're not aware of, she has a right to remain in her assigned seat." "We'll finalize this in a moment," he said, nodding once at Cassandra before turning back to the front. He had a sense that something else was fueling Regina's insistence. But from all appearances, Cassandra was well within her rights. Unknown to him, the drama was only beginning, and it would soon escalate far beyond a simple seat dispute. With the seat dispute unresolved, tension hovered over the cabin like a dark cloud. The door had been closed, the jet bridge retracted, and the plane was pushed back from the gate. Captain Grayson, somewhat convinced that Cassandra could keep her seat, returned to the cockpit to proceed with taxi procedures. Meanwhile, Regina fumed her authority, apparently challenged before both passengers and flight crew. Just as the Boeing 737 was lining up for takeoff, a buzzing interphone call shattered the cockpit's focus. Grayson glanced at his co-pilot, who shrugged and answered. As they shared a hushed conversation, a flicker of surprise crossed the co-pilot's face. "It's the airline's headquarters," he whispered to Captain Grayson. "They said there's an urgent call from the owner." Grayson felt a jolt. Calls from the top brass in the middle of an active flight scenario were practically unheard of. Worse yet, The tower was already instructing them to move onto the runway. He signaled the air traffic controller that they needed a brief hold. "Patch it through," he told his co-pilot, ignoring the swirl of confusion building in the pit of his stomach. The line crackled, and a calm but commanding voice emerged. "Captain Grayson, this is James Harrington, owner of Aerosky Wings. I understand you have a situation on board involving a passenger and an exit row seat." Grayson raised a brow. He had met Harrington only once years ago, and found him to be a brilliant but distant figure. The fact that the man was calling personally was astounding. "Yes, Mr. Harrington, we had a minor dispute about seat assignments, but I believe we can resolve it." Harrington's voice, cool and measured, filled the cockpit. "I'm going to insist you halt the plane and reopen the cabin door. I'd like to speak with the flight attendants and the passenger in question immediately." Grayson blinked in disbelief. "Sir, we're third in line for takeoff. The controllers will not be happy about a last-minute taxi back to the gate. I'll deal with air traffic control and the ground staff." Harrington interjected. "I have reason to believe Miss Cassandra Lewis is being discriminated against. This is more than a seat dispute. I want this plane returned to the gate right now." Grayson's pulse quickened. He tried to steady his voice. "Understood, sir." Hanging up, he signaled the tower again. His co-pilot's eyes were wide, but years of training kept them calm. "We have to head back," Grayson said quietly. And so in a dramatic twist, the Boeing 737 began to taxi off the runway and back towards the terminal, leaving curious air traffic controllers and perplexed ground crews scrambling. The cabin erupted in murmurs and confusion as the sudden change of plan was announced. Unbeknownst to everyone, the plane had become the center of a power play, reaching all the way to the top echelons of Aerosky Wings. The moment the Boeing 737 rolled to a stop back at the gate, a collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged anxious looks, some panicking that they'd miss connecting flights or important events. Others, enthralled by the drama, sat in stunned silence. Never had they seen an aircraft prepare for takeoff, only to abruptly return to the gate because of a seat dispute. Regina's face had gone pale. Marcus looked equally unsettled, glancing from passenger to passenger, as though hoping to find a sympathetic pair of eyes. Cassandra, meanwhile, felt her heart pounding in her ears. She'd never intended to cause such upheaval. She only wanted the seat she'd rightfully booked. Now the entire plane was being uprooted, and apparently the airline owner himself was involved. Over the loudspeaker, Captain Grayson's authoritative voice tried to maintain decorum. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this unexpected delay. We've been requested by headquarters to return to the gate. We understand this is highly unusual, and we appreciate your patience." Within minutes, the cabin door was reopened and the jet bridge reattached. A flurry of airline officials in suits poured on board. They spoke briefly with Regina and Marcus, then with Captain Grayson, each conversation hushed and tense. Eventually, a woman with a company badge approached Cassandra. "Ms. Lewis," she said softly, "I'm from Aerosky Corporate. We'd like you to come with us to the terminal for a conversation with Mr. Harrington, our owner, via video conference. He's requesting to speak with you personally, along with the flight attendants involved." Cassandra's eyes widened. "Right now," the representative nodded, offering a thin, apologetic smile. "Yes, ma'am. We realize this is highly unconventional, but Mr. Harrington insists." Reluctantly, Cassandra unbuckled her seatbelt, stood, and collected her carry-on. She felt every pair of eyes on her as she navigated the aisle. Regina and Marcus were also asked to deplane. The hush that followed them was broken only by scattered coughs and whispered speculation among the passengers. Once inside the terminal, they were ushered into a small conference room, usually reserved for urgent airport meetings. A large screen at one end flickered to life, revealing the stern face of James Harrington. Though he was in a remote office, his intense gaze and clipped tone commanded the space as though he were standing right there. And so the stage was set for a high-stakes confrontation no one could have predicted, one that would lay bare the truth behind Regina's actions, challenge Cassandra's fortitude, and spark a chain of events that would reverberate beyond the confines of that airport gate. Cassandra sat between Marcus and Regina, a row of plastic chairs facing the large screen. A handful of Aerosky officials stood in the background, arms folded, as if bracing themselves for a storm. On the screen, James Harrington looked formidable, a man in his 60s, silver hair, sharp suit, and piercing eyes. His silence weighed heavily, as though he was sizing them up without a word. Finally, Harrington spoke. "Ms. Lewis, I apologize for this inconvenience. I'm told you were assigned an exit row seat and then asked to move without valid reason." Cassandra cleared her throat. "Yes, Mr. Harrington. That's correct. I was told I couldn't sit there, even though I meet all safety requirements, and it's on my boarding pass." Harrington's gaze shifted. "Ms. Regina Jones, is that all?" "Your name?" he asked, eyes pinning the flight attendant. Regina nodded wordlessly, face tight with a mix of defiance and fear. "On what grounds did you deny Ms. Lewis the seat she'd legally booked?" Regina shifted, clearly unsettled by the direct questioning. "I made a judgment call," she said, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "I felt Ms. Lewis may not be the best candidate to operate the exit in an emergency. That's my prerogative as a lead flight attendant." Harrington folded his hands. "So you're telling me you believe Ms. Lewis to be physically or mentally incapable?" Regina's voice wavered. It wasn't just about capability. She shot a quick glance at Cassandra, then looked away. There was a bit of an argument. She seemed upset and maybe wasn't in the right frame of mind. Marcus fidgeted beside Cassandra. He cleared his throat. With all due respect, Ms. Lewis was calm and polite. She never refused to comply with safety procedures. In fact, she just wanted to understand why she was being singled out. An uneasy silence fell. Harrington looked from Regina to Marcus, then back. "It's my understanding that Ms. Lewis had no recorded violations, no security issues. She's an accomplished professional and well within the guidelines for an exit row seat." His voice dropped an octave. "Which makes me wonder if your actions were influenced by something other than safety, Miss Jones." Regina's eyes flicked up in alarm. "Sir, I assure you." But Harrington cut her off. "I've received multiple passenger reports hinting at discriminatory behavior. You do realize that's grounds for serious consequences." A hush settled over the room. Cassandra felt both vindicated and strangely anxious. She had never intended to escalate the situation to this extreme. Yet here it was, a public reckoning. Regina's face twisted with panic, as though her carefully curated shield of authority had shattered. Outside, through a glass wall, passengers waiting in the terminal lined up to board another flight. Life moved on, oblivious to the drama unfolding just a few feet away. But inside that small conference room, the tension was a living, breathing entity, and it was on the brink of erupting into a full-blown upheaval. As Harrington prepared to address the company officials in the room, Cassandra found herself lost in thought. Why was the airline owner so personally invested? Sure, Aerosky was known for its strong corporate stance on customer service, but this level of involvement was unprecedented. Then a thought struck her. Maybe Mr. Harrington had personal reasons or experiences that made him extra vigilant about racial discrimination. Her quiet speculation was interrupted by the clearing of a throat. One of the Aerosky executives, whose name badge read Damien Cole, VP of Operations, stepped forward. "Mr. Harrington, shall we proceed with—" the rest he asked carefully, eyes flickering toward Cassandra. Harrington nodded gravely. "Yes, I think it's time Ms. Lewis learned the truth." Cassandra's heart fluttered. What truth was he talking about? Regina and Marcus exchanged puzzled glances. The other airline officials remained stoic. Harrington folded his hands together on his desk, looking directly at Cassandra through the screen. "Ms. Lewis, I usually guard my family connections quite closely, but I've been following your career for a while." Cassandra's breath caught in her throat. Why would the owner of Aerosky follow her career? Then he continued. "I've known your father for years, although we haven't spoken in some time. He helped me build early marketing campaigns for Aerosky when we started. He never mentioned you by name, but when I learned you were traveling with our airline, I decided I wanted to ensure your experience was exemplary. Then my staff flagged a situation with your seat." Harrington's words rolled over Cassandra like a slow, disorienting wave. Was this some kind of cosmic coincidence? She recalled her father's occasional mentions of a James Harrington, a business acquaintance from decades ago. Never once had she imagined that this Harrington was the owner of a major airline. Harrington sighed. "I only stepped in personally because I suspected something deeper was at play. A pattern of biases that occasionally surfaces among our cabin staff, despite our training. Ms. Lewis, your father's a good man, and I regret not keeping in closer contact. I wanted to ensure no wrongdoing tarnished your or anyone's travel experience." The confession left Cassandra reeling. She had always believed in forging her own path, separate from her father's connections. To be caught in this swirl of nepotism and corporate might was unnerving. She could see Regina's eyes widen in shock, perhaps realizing she had tangled with a passenger who had far more invisible support than she'd assumed. "Now," Harrington said, fixing Regina with a steely gaze, "I expect a thorough explanation." All eyes turned to Regina. Her lips quivered. In that moment, she seemed to realize that her attempt at asserting power had backfired catastrophically. The question was, would she come clean or dig herself a deeper hole? The silence in the room was no longer still. It buzzed. Cassandra sat frozen in her chair, her heart thudding like it had learned a new, faster rhythm. Her hands were clenched, though she hadn't realized it until she felt her nails pressing into her palms. Across from her, Regina stared at a spot on the floor, her mouth a taut line, her jaw visibly tight. Her body language no longer carried the confidence of earlier. Now she looked like someone balancing on the edge of something sharp. The corporate room inside the terminal had become a pressure cooker. The walls seemed to breathe with tension, even as the video screen where James Harrington, the airline's owner, had spoken, went dark. His final words still echoed embedded in the air like heat after lightning. "Discrimination, whether overt or subtle, has no place in my airline." Regina's world had tilted, and everyone could feel it. But what came next, no one could predict. Not even Cassandra. The HR representative glanced at a clipboard. "Ms. Jones, if you'd like to respond to Mr. Harrington's remarks. This is your opportunity." Regina hesitated, her throat working as she swallowed. Her eyes flicked toward Marcus, who stood by the wall, arms crossed, face unreadable. Finally, she exhaled. "I didn't mean for things to go this far." She began, her voice tight but composed. "I had concerns about Ms. Lewis's attitude." Cassandra felt her spine go rigid. That word, attitude, always coded, always sharp. A word that was never neutral when applied to black women in professional or public spaces. She seemed overly insistent. I felt she might not remain calm in an emergency situation, Regina continued. So I asked her to move. I didn't intend it to escalate. Overly insistent, Cassandra repeated quietly to herself, her tone flat. Her mind spun through every instance in her life when asserting her rights had been mistaken for aggression at work, in stores, even in classrooms. She had been fighting this narrative her whole life. One of the Aerosky officials cleared his throat and turned toward Marcus. "Is there anything you'd like to add?" Marcus looked visibly uncomfortable, caught in the gravitational pull between loyalty and conscience. His mouth opened, then closed again. Finally, he looked at Cassandra, not with pity, but with something that resembled guilt. I think we need to be honest here," Marcus said, his voice low but steady. "Regina has made comments before. Comments that implied some passengers were more likely to cause issues, usually based on appearances or race." Regina's head whipped toward him. "Marcus." But he didn't stop. "She told me to double-check Ms. Lewis's boarding pass. She said it didn't look right. When I asked what she meant, she brushed me off. But I knew." The room stilled. Even the HR officer froze, pen hovering above paper. Marcus turned to Cassandra. "I didn't say anything earlier because I thought maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe I misunderstood. But the truth is I didn't. And I should have spoken up sooner." Cassandra met his gaze. "You did." Now she said softly, "That still matters." Regina's composure began to crack. Her mouth opened, her voice raising an octave. "That's not fair. I've worked here for 13 years. You're taking one moment, one judgment call, and twisting it." The HR official held up a hand. "Ms. Jones, we've received multiple reports from passengers who witnessed the exchange. Some have already shared video footage, and more are coming in." Regina shook her head. "People don't understand what we deal with. They don't see the pressure. They don't see the real threats." "You're right," Cassandra said suddenly, her voice sharp but even. "I don't see all of it, but I do see when someone like me, doing everything right, gets targeted just for existing in a seat I paid for." Her words hung in the air like a dropped stone in still water. The HR representative stepped in. Based on the evidence presented and considering prior internal reports that now merit re-evaluation, "Ms. Jones, you are being placed on immediate suspension, pending a full investigation. Effective immediately, you are removed from all scheduled flights." Regina gasped as though she had been slapped. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Cassandra remained still, processing the moment. There was no surge of triumph, no desire to smirk or gloat, just a quiet, aching relief that at last someone had been forced to see the truth. Regina was escorted out by 2 staff members, her steps stiff and robotic. As the door closed behind her, the room seemed to breathe again. Marcus moved toward the center, clearly shaken. "I'm sorry," he said again, this time to the room, but his eyes stayed on Cassandra. "I've never seen anything like this. I thought I was helping her at first. But now—" "You're helping now," Cassandra said. She surprised herself with the softness in her tone. And that's a start. He looked grateful, if not entirely at peace. The HR official approached Cassandra next. "We'd like to escort you back to the gate," she said. "We'll be reboarding shortly with a new lead flight attendant. Your seat 12A has been held. And there's something else." She handed Cassandra a folded slip of paper, an apology letter signed by James Harrington himself. "Ms. Lewis, thank you for your strength, grace, and clarity in the face of adversity. We failed you, and we are committed to making this right. James Harrington, owner, Aerosky. Wings." Cassandra nodded slowly. She tucked the letter into her bag beside Marcus's phone number and the note from Olivia. She would keep them all not as trophies, but as proof. Evidence that the truth once forced into light had the power to move giants. As she stepped out of the conference room and back into the terminal, the morning sun had begun to rise, casting golden slants across the floor. Justice had spoken. Not with fury, but with firmness. Not with vengeance, but with resolve. And Cassandra walked toward her gate not just as a passenger, but as a woman who had changed the course of a flight and perhaps a company with nothing more than her presence and her voice. The conference room had grown quiet. The tension that once pulsed through the walls had begun to dissipate, but its aftershocks still rippled across the floor like the lingering tremor after a storm. Cassandra sat rooted in her chair, her back straight, but her limbs heavy. Fatigue, anger, and a strange form of triumph swirled through her all at once. Regina had fallen silent, her earlier bluster reduced to a cold, pale stillness. Her hands were clenched in her lap, knuckles white. She avoided everyone's eyes, her jaw tight as if willing herself invisible. The screen had gone dark just moments ago, the final image being that of James Harrington, delivering his parting words, measured direct and impossible to forget out. Discrimination, whether subtle or overt, has no place aboard my airline, and I will not tolerate it. With that, the owner of Aerosky Wings had made his stance clear. And for the first time that day, Cassandra felt the scales tip back toward balance. The door opened gently. A corporate liaison stepped in, whispering something into the ear of the HR official. The woman nodded, turned to Regina, and said evenly, "Ms. Jones, please come with us." Regina stood stiffly, her movements mechanical. As she turned to leave, she paused only briefly, just long enough to cast a final look at Cassandra. There was no apology in her eyes, no regret, only the raw wound of humiliation. But Cassandra didn't return the glare. She didn't flinch or gloat. She simply held her gaze steady and silent until Regina looked away. The door clicked shut behind her. Marcus remained behind, standing near the back wall like a schoolboy who'd just confessed to cheating on a test. His shoulders sagged, his expression haunted. But there was also something else in his eyes now, liberation. When he finally spoke, it was in a soft, cracked voice. "I know my apology doesn't erase what happened, but I meant it, Ms. Lewis. I really did. I should have stopped it sooner. I should have spoken up the moment she whispered those things to me." Cassandra nodded slowly. "You did speak up eventually. That matters." He handed her a small note, his name and number scrawled neatly. "If you ever need a statement, or a witness, anything, I'll tell the truth." She tucked it into her bag. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. The HR official approached next, holding a folder. Ms. Lewis, we've rebooked you on the same flight with a newly assigned lead attendant. The crew has been briefed, and you'll be reseated in your original exit row 12A. We also want to extend a formal apology on behalf of Aerosky. Cassandra nodded, not out of politeness, but because she was too tired to summon anything else. Understood. And the woman added, her voice slightly warmer. Now we'd like to offer you complimentary first-class upgrades on any Aerosky flights for the next year. It's a small gesture, but one we hope will remind you we're listening. Cassandra managed a small smile. Thank you. I appreciate the gesture more than the seat. As the meeting wrapped up, she found herself standing alone in the hallway outside the conference room. The chaos had ended. The storm had passed. But the adrenaline hadn't yet left her system. She stared out the terminal window, watching another plane taxi slowly down the runway. She imagined herself in one of those tiny windows, high above the clouds, leaving behind the weight of the last few hours. She thought of the people who had spoken up for her, the ones who filmed, who asked questions, who stayed seated in solidarity. Then she thought of her father, his voice steady, always telling her, "They may try to move you, but don't you move unless it's your choice." Today she hadn't moved. The justice hadn't come easy. It never did. But it had come. And for the first time in a long time, Cassandra felt something close to peace. She reached into her bag and pulled out the boarding pass for her rebooked flight, still 12A, still exit row. But now it meant more than legroom. It meant presence, proof. She had faced the fire and remained standing. As she made her way back toward the gate, the intercom echoed overhead. Aerosky Wings, Flight 348 to Chicago, now reboarding at Gate 47. Passengers in Group A, please prepare to board. Cassandra took a breath, her spine straightening with purpose. She stepped forward, her boarding pass in hand, and walked toward the gate like a woman who owned every inch of the space beneath her. Karma had spoken, and it had spoken in her favor. 3 hours had passed since Cassandra and the flight crew were escorted off the plane. 3 long, surreal hours filled with corporate interrogations, awkward apologies, and the kind of justice that comes not in grand gestures, but in quiet, necessary reckonings. Now Cassandra stood once again at the base of the jet bridge, her boarding pass freshly reissued, and in her hand, still marked with the bold designation, 12A Exit Row. The gate agent gave her a respectful nod, one that seemed tinged with unspoken understanding. Cassandra returned the gesture before stepping into the aircraft. The cabin felt the same, yet markedly different. The overhead lights glowed warmly. The usual pre-flight bustle hummed. But the energy, the air itself, carried something new reverence. As she walked down the aisle, more than a few passengers looked up. Some smiled. A middle-aged woman near the front gave her a subtle thumbs up. Across the cabin, the young woman who had defended her earlier gave a soft wave. The elderly black man, who had spoken up, nodded slowly, a dignified look in his eyes that seemed to say, "You did good, young lady." Cassandra offered a faint smile, acknowledging their support. No one said anything aloud. They didn't need to. The silence was its own kind of applause. When she reached row 12, her eyes caught on a small note taped discreetly to the seatback tray. Folded neatly and scrawled in tidy cursive, it read, "Ms. Lewis, I'm truly sorry for what happened earlier. We're honored to have you flying with us. If you need anything at all during the flight, please let me know. Olivia, flight attendant." Cassandra's throat tightened as she slid into her seat. The extra legroom felt different now. no longer just a matter of physical comfort, but symbolic. A space she had fought for. A space she had claimed not just for herself, but for anyone who'd ever been told in subtle or overt ways, "You don't belong here." She folded the note and tucked it into her carry-on, intending to keep it. Not as a souvenir, but as a quiet reminder. Moments later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back aboard. We appreciate your patience during today's unexpected delay. On behalf of Aerosky Wings, we apologize and thank you for flying with us. Our journey to Chicago will begin shortly." Cassandra closed her eyes, the words washing over her like a warm current. The captain didn't mention her by name. He didn't need to. The message was clear enough. From her window seat across the aisle, a child peeked out with wide, curious eyes. The boy's mother leaned over and whispered something, then smiled at Cassandra. Cassandra smiled back, her expression soft, but resolute. As the aircraft doors sealed and the final safety checks were completed, the familiar whine of the engine spooling up filled the cabin. The lights dimmed slightly, casting a warm glow over the rows. Cassandra rested her head against the seat, exhaling slowly. The worst was behind her. The flight delayed and reshuffled was finally in motion. As the wheels lifted off the tarmac, the plane banked gently into the orange hues of early evening. The city fell away beneath them, lights twinkling like distant stars fading slowly into the clouds. Cassandra looked out the window, watching the skyline dissolve. A strange peace settled in her chest. Not the kind that erases the pain, but the kind that follows after standing firm, after being seen, after surviving the storm without breaking. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to rest. Across the aisle, the elderly man gave her another nod, this time a bit firmer. Cassandra returned it, her lips parting in a quiet, knowing smile. She had come aboard seeking comfort and found conflict. But now she was returning to the sky with something much greater dignity, clarity, and an unshakable truth. Her voice mattered, and no turbulence, literal or figurative, could take that away. By the time Cassandra stepped off the plane at Chicago O'Hare, the first light of dawn was beginning to stretch its pale fingers across the skyline. The airport, typically a hive of movement and urgency, now felt hushed and reverent, as if the world itself were pausing to take a breath. She dragged her carry-on through the terminal, her steps steady but slow, the fatigue of a sleepless night pressing against her shoulders like an invisible weight. The events of the past 24 hours played back in fragments, sharp flashes of emotion and confrontation. The seat denial, the humiliating confrontation with the flight crew, the surreal moment when the captain received a personal call from the airline's owner, the sudden halt of the aircraft on the tarmac, and finally the high-stakes meeting with James Harrington that shifted everything. It felt both like a blur and an eternity. Her phone buzzed as she reached the edge of the baggage claim area. A message from her cousin Janelle glowed on the screen. "Hey Cass, so glad you made it. Don't worry about the delay. We've saved you a seat at breakfast. Just get here safe. Love you." A breath escaped Cassandra's lips, a sigh that seemed to carry with it all the tension of the previous day. She tapped out a quick reply, her thumbs heavy with exhaustion, but her spirit oddly renewed. Then she caught her own reflection in a large glass panel beside the escalator. Her hair was slightly tousled, and her eyes were ringed with fatigue. But beneath the weariness was something else, resolve. A quiet fire that hadn't been there the day before. She hadn't just stood up for herself on that flight. She had stood up for something bigger. Something that reached beyond seat numbers and airline policies. She had faced prejudice in one of its many subtle forms, and instead of backing down, she'd stood her ground with grace, clarity, and conviction. As she waited for her bag to emerge from the carousel, Cassandra noticed a few passengers from her flight lingering nearby. One or two offered her soft nods of acknowledgement, silent echoes of solidarity. Their support hadn't been loud or theatrical, but it had mattered. Every person who had spoken up, recorded footage, or simply offered a sympathetic glance had added weight to her truth. Later that morning, after reuniting with her family and freshening up at her hotel, Cassandra arrived at the rehearsal breakfast fashionably late, but very much present. Her family greeted her with open arms laughter and relieved tears. Janelle rushed over and hugged her tightly. "You look like you've been through a war," her cousin whispered with a knowing smile. Cassandra chuckled. "You have no idea. They didn't need to dwell on the details. For now it was enough to be surrounded by joy, celebration, and people who loved her." She allowed herself to be swept up in the moment, plates of waffles and bacon stories from childhood, the clinking of coffee mugs. The air felt lighter, the world more open. Days later, Cassandra would learn that Regina had been officially terminated following a thorough internal investigation. Additional complaints from past flights had surfaced, painting a consistent and troubling picture. Meanwhile, Marcus, whose reluctant honesty helped tip the scales, had been transferred to a different route and was now working with Aerosky's diversity and inclusion team to develop new training modules for staff. James Harrington personally reached out to Cassandra's father to rekindle a long-dormant friendship. The conversation reportedly ended with a promise that Aerosky would institute stricter accountability standards and create safer, more inclusive policies, not just in theory, but in action. Cassandra also received a handwritten apology from the airline's executive board. Along with it came a complimentary first-class membership for a year and an invitation to speak should she ever want to share her story in their leadership training programs. But none of those gestures mattered more than what she had gained within herself. She had entered that airport, simply seeking legroom, just a little space to breathe. She emerged from the ordeal with something far greater, the reminder that her voice mattered, that standing firm, even when exhausted and alone, could shift tides, that bias could be called out, and change could follow even at 35,000 feet. As Cassandra stepped outside into the crisp Chicago morning, suitcase in hand, she inhaled deeply. The air was cool and alive with promise. Taxis honked, hotel shuttles idled, and the city stretched before her like a clean slate. Whatever lay ahead, wedding celebrations, boardroom meetings, future flights, she would walk into it stronger. Because now she knew no one could take her seat again. What began as a quest for a little extra legroom became a stirring drama of truth and transformation. Cassandra Lewis's defiance against injustice led to a high-altitude standoff, a personal intervention from Aerosky's owner, and ultimately a resounding victory for fairness. Her courage shone a spotlight on deep-rooted biases, reminding us that our every action, especially in crowded spaces like airplanes, carries weight. If Cassandra's story inspires you to stand firm for your rights or support someone else who's been wronged, then share this powerful message. Let's spread awareness about the subtle injustices that too often go unchallenged. By refusing to stay silent, we can turn small ripples into tidal waves of change. If you found this story compelling, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Your voice amplifies the call for equality and respect in every space we occupy. Let's keep soaring together.